Let me first of all turn to Roos, who is a Eurodeputee, Vice President of the European Conservatives and Reformists. I like that word, conservative and reformist. Excellent. Rob has great experience indeed in construction, in oil, gas, and infrastructure, so he knows well the question of energy. If you'd like just to stand up while you speak, but if you insist on sitting down, that's okay too. Here, I'll pass you the microphone. A big hand. Or you can stand there if you like.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, dear friends, for having me here. Today, I will talk about the erosion of democracy on the national level by technocracy. Across the West, power has been delegated from the level of the national government to various actors over the last decades. These actors all have a number of things in common. First, their democratic legitimacy is zero or close to zero. Second, they make sure that globalist values always prevail over national sovereignty, that power is always centralized, not decentralized, and that government's interventions in people's lives always increases, never decreases. And third, these actors themselves accelerate the circumvention of national democracy by taking even more power from the nation states in the process. I will talk about a number of these actors here. The EU, the courts, and the United Nations. And I will mention ways in which we as freedom fighters worldwide should counter this development. But now, the developments that erode our democracy. First of all, the EU, which this audience, I don't think this needs much of an introduction, to be honest. The EU was established in 1992 to accelerate economic cooperation between sovereign states in Europe. Now, veto rights in most areas have been abolished. And the Commission, the unelected Commission, has the right of legislative initiative. In practice, this means we have become provinces of an EU superstate already. The EU is also eager to take away the last veto powers on foreign policy and security and defense policy. These are the last competences which prevent the EU from acting as a fully fledged superpower internationally. As always, the EU acts according to the principle, never waste a good crisis. It abuses the terrible war in Ukraine to push member states into abolishing the foreign and defense policy veto. We should make sure that this doesn't happen. Because let's remember, the EU's model is based on a one-size-fits-all approach, which in reality leads to a one-size-fits-none policy. But even if this veto stays in place, the EU is still threatening to steamroll our democracies and our economies. The Green Deal is revolutionary in all the wrong ways. It's causing centralization and social engineering on a massive scale. Because let's be clear about this, when carbon emissions are supposedly the problem, but everything we do leads to carbon emissions, then the EU solution is to monitor and regulate everything we do in our lives. We are embarking on an unprecedented experiment with our economy and with our democracy. And I'm not sure we will be fine. I'm extremely worried that our prosperity and our way of life, which are unique in all of history, will not survive this. Another institution to which power has been delegated is the courts. We have to talk about the primacy of the European Union law. The fact that EU law supersedes national law already shows us what the state of affairs is. Of course, deep economic cooperation within the single market requires that member states have similar legislation in this regard. However, the obvious solution for this would be to require member states to incorporate this into their national law upon entering the single market, but not to set up a completely new system that overrides national law. In the Netherlands, courts have no right of constitutional review. This is explicitly a task of the legislator, rightly so, because the parliament has a democratic mandate and should be the most powerful institution. But because of this primacy of EU law, courts now do have the right to shoot down laws and rules that are supposedly not in line with EU law. As a result, courts now hold the power that our constitution explicitly refused to grant them. This has immense consequences. Remember the big farmers' protest in the Netherlands? They happened because of a process set in motion by the Dutch High Court, which ruled that the Dutch system of granting nitrogen permission is not in line with law. Left liberal politicians seized this opportunity to call for a reduction of cattle by 50%. Our nitrogen legislation is now the strictest in all of Europe. This has become the most hotly contested political issue in the Netherlands. The main reason for this, in my view, is the primacy of EU law. Another aspect here is that Dutch law allows procedures in the name of the common good. In practice, this allows philanthropists, this means oligarchs, to bankroll NGOs that start procedure after procedure against the state, but also against ordinary farmers. This possibility to start a judicial procedure in the name of the common good should absolutely be abolished. But there is more. International treaties form a legal trap. Governments can sign international agreements without prior approval from the Dutch parliament. In other words, these agreements are not codified in the Dutch law. However, when some climate NGO sues the governments over not abiding some of the targets set out in this international agreement, courts will judge in favor of this NGO. Sometimes the explanation is extremely far-fetched. For example, the Human Rights Convention includes the duty to protect life. This meant you have the right not to be killed by your government. But courts now say this means governments are obliged to reduce carbon emissions. Yes, this is judicial activism. But there is a more fundamental point here. Globalist interest groups use international treaties to circumvent our democratic process. Now I will talk about the third actor, engaging to circumvent our democracy, the United Nations. When the internet came up, people suddenly had access to all sorts of information. This was no longer filtered by government or oligarch-owned media. The elites lost control over the people, and therefore they had to invent something new. In 2015, they implemented the UN Agenda 2030. Practically, this meant the birth of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. All of these goals have one thing in common. They sound so good, they will supposedly create an ideal world. But when I was young, my mother always told me, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. A valuable lesson that has been proven here as well. The SDGs do not benefit all countries, all people, or all segments of society. Rather, they are supranational, they are anti-democratic, and they are top-down. Unelected bureaucrats working at the UN cannot be held accountable by voters, but do have power. There is no document in the Dutch Ministry of Development Aid that will not mention the SDGs. Serious money is spent on this. While the UN itself is being pushed in certain directions by powerful NGOs, which in turn are funded by so-called philanthropists with big financial interests. Often these philanthropists also own large media outlets. Big business and big government go hand in hand. And I will give some examples of SDGs and their implementation in practice. One of the SDGs is no poverty, and who can be against this? But the solution is supposedly the introduction of a universal basic income. And this means billions of people would become dependent on the state. A neo-communist dream, but a nightmare for everyone who values freedom. Another example, zero hunger. Beautiful. But we already managed to eliminate worldwide food shortages. The only problem is distribution of food. There is no shortage, thanks to the brilliant invention of fertilizers. One problem, fertilizers do not fit into the green agenda. I will cut some of the examples out. I will take one. Some of the other examples are SDGs, clean energy. This means we abandon affordable and reliable energy upon which we build our prosperity. Instead, we embrace unreliable and expensive renewables that have plunged Europe into an energy crisis and skyrocketing inflation. Hooray! The way I see it is as follows. Socialists love poor people because poor people depend on the state. And if people depend on the state, it provides power to the elites. The globalist socialist agenda is wrapped up inside the Sustainable Development Goals. Meanwhile, all the new laws implemented because of these SDGs create bureaucracy and destroy small and medium-sized businesses. The result, big business takes over. We always see big business and big government go hand in hand. The former gets the money, the latter the power. Now I will come to my conclusions. There are three technocratic threats to our democracy: the EU, supranational agreements, and the UN. What should we, as freedom fighters, do about it? First, we should recognize it for what it is: a global attempt to centralize policymaking at the expense of our sovereignty, our nation state, and our way of life. Second, we should propose alternatives and stick to those while in power. For the EU, a great idea was raised last year, and I have to be careful now, please hear me out. It's not often that I praise French President Macron, but a broken clock is also right twice a day, and miracles sometimes do happen. Last year, Macron came up with a good idea, the European Political Community. My suggestion, turn this into a European Union of multiple directions. Let us all have a high degree of economic cooperation, but let countries decide for themselves on what issues they wish to cooperate further. A European Union à la carte. I would be very happy for the Netherlands to move to Tier 2, alongside perhaps the UK. Yes to economic cooperation and voluntary partnerships, but no to a superstate. Let the European Commission become a secretariat, the European Parliament an inter-parliamentary body consisting of representatives from the national parliament, and let the Council have the lead, all on an intergovernmental basis with full powers restored. I'm almost there. For the courts, agree on economic legislation that should be incorporated by every member state to remain part of the single market. But restore the supremacy of national law and let parliaments have the last word. And for the UN, Reject the Agenda 2030. Embrace our traditional way of life. Empower schools to educate in the way we have done it over the last century, with focus on science, humanities, and the arts, not on gender ideology, and certainly not on this anti-Western guilt cult. Embrace new energy technologies, but do not do away our trusted energy sources before we have better ones. Act not from the idea that we should completely change our society, but act from the idea that our ancestors have handed over to us something very precious and special, which we should cherish and cannot afford to damage. I believe this is the way forward, and I believe if we act like this, our best days are still ahead of us. Thank you very much.